Welcome back, everybody. We are here today to discuss a game that changed RPGs entirely, introducing a completely new party system and revolutionizing exploration. This game can be considered the primary building block in an ever-growing franchise that has given gamers some of the most popular titles of all time. So grab a seat in a Capri Sun, turn on your tube TV, and let's rewind to 1990. In late 1988, Square was beginning to establish themselves. Final Fantasy I had been popular, and Final Fantasy II had proven they weren't a one-hit wonder. But as the 1990s approached, gaming was nearing the transition to a 16-bit era. Sakaguchi, the series director, knew that for the third entry, more of the same just wouldn't cut it. The plan for Final Fantasy III was a massive undertaking, to create the largest, most technically advanced RPG ever seen on an 8-bit console. But development hit a wall early on. The team's primary programmer was an Iranian American named Nasir Gebelli. Nasir was a rockstar coder who didn't use manuals. Instead, he wrote assembly code directly from his head. However, mid-development, Nasir's Japanese work visa expired and he had to go home to California. Sakaguchi faced a choice: either replace the man who held the game's logic in his brain, or follow him. He chose the latter. In one of the most famous stories in gaming history, the core Square team packed their computers and moved into a hotel in Sacramento, California. They spent months in an American suburb, finishing the final half of the game in a makeshift office just to stay near Nasir's terminal. Designers Hiromichi Tanaka and Kazuhiko Aoki were reinventing the genre's DNA. They looked at the level-up system of Final Fantasy II, where your abilities got better as skills were used, and realized that it was just too grindy. This led to the birth of the job system. And now we can't talk about the jobs without mentioning the legendary Onion Knight. In the original version, this was your starting class, and for most of the game, they were statistically useless. But there was a secret hidden in the code. If you had the patience to grind an Onion Knight all the way to level 92, their stats would suddenly explode, making them the most powerful characters in the game. It was one of the first true secrets in the series that rewarded the most dedicated players for sticking with a seemingly weak character. For the first time, your characters weren't locked into a class. You could be a warrior for one dungeon and switch that character to a black mage for the next. This wasn't just a mechanic, it was a philosophy that changed RPGs from static stories into tactical playgrounds. But they didn't stop at jobs. Final Fantasy III is the birthplace of the franchise's identity. This is the first game to introduce summons, which included Chocobo, Shiva, Ramuh, Ifrit, Titan, Odin, Leviathan, and Bahamut. It turned magic from a menu command into a cinematic event. It also introduced the Moogles. Every gamer knows the Kupo sound, but it started here. Moogles were introduced as the bodyguards of the great mage Doga. It introduced the airships, which included Cid's airship, the Enterprise, the Nautilus, and the Invincible. Nasir Gebelli used a coding trick to make the Invincible and Cid's airship move with a shadow and a high-speed scrolling that actually outpaced the NES's hardware refresh rate. Players started on a floating continent, believing it was the entire world, only to descend and realize the actual world was 10 times larger and submerged underwater. How was all of this possible on a console that started with Donkey Kong? The answer lies in the cartridge size. Final Fantasy III used a 4 megabit 512 kilobyte cartridge. To put that in perspective, the original Super Mario Bros. Was only 40 kilobytes. Square was pushing the limits of the silicon itself. Nasir Gebelli used a technique called bank switching, which allowed the game to rapidly swap pieces of memory in and out of the CPU's view. This allowed for the first auto-targeting system in an RPG. Before Final Fantasy III, if your character targeted an enemy that died before their turn, they would just swing at thin air. Final Fantasy III's code was smart enough to reroute that attack to a living target. This complexity, however, became a double-edged sword. The code was so tightly optimized and messy, due to Nasir's unique style, that when Square tried to port it to other consoles later, they literally could not do it. The code was so entangled with the NES's hardware that it took nearly 16 years to finally remake the game because no one could figure out the secrets of Nasir's code. It sold 1.4 million copies in Japan alone. In comparison, Final Fantasy II sold about 760,000 copies, so Final Fantasy III had nearly doubled its predecessor's success. In Japan, it actually outperformed The Legend of Zelda at 1.1 million, and even Mega Man 2 also at 1.1 million. It proved that the RPG was no longer a niche hobby, it was the main event of Japanese gaming. So why didn't we get it in the West? By the time the Japanese version was a hit, the Super Famicom was only months away. Square's American branch, Squaresoft, looked at the timeline and realized that translating the massive amount of text in Final Fantasy III would take an entire year. By then, 16-bit graphics would make 8-bit games look like ancient history. Square made the brutal decision to cancel the Western NES release and focus all manpower on Final Fantasy IV for the SNES. This decision created a decade of confusion where Westerners played Final Fantasy IV as Final Fantasy II, and Final Fantasy VI was Final Fantasy III, while the real Final Fantasy III became a lost legend only heard about in magazines. The impact of Final Fantasy III on gaming culture cannot be overstated. First, there is the job system. Every game from Bravely Default to Octopath Traveler and even the class-changing mechanics in World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XV can trace their lineage back to this 1990 cartridge. It taught players that a hero didn't have to be one thing. They could be anything the player needed them to be. Second, it established the massive map size. Before Final Fantasy III, RPGs were mostly about one map and a single villain. Final Fantasy III introduced the concept of the nested world, the idea that the world you see is just a small part of a much larger, more complex reality. Finally, it cemented Square as the kings of technical flexing. For example, even the final boss, the Cloud of Darkness, broke the mold. Instead of a traditional monster, we got this eerie, multi-faced entity that represented the void. Amano's design was so complex that the programmer had to use a flickering sprite technique just to display her correctly on the NES hardware without the console crashing. They weren't just storytellers. They were the NASA of gaming, willing to move across the world and break hardware limitations just to put a few more pixels on the screen. Final Fantasy III was the grand finale of the 8-bit era. It was a game that refused to be contained by its console, written by a team that refused to be contained by their country, and a legacy that 30 years later still defines what most people would consider the fundamentals of an RPG. For fun, I rated this at an 8 out of 10. I personally wanted to rank this higher as I'm a huge Final Fantasy fan, and I grew up playing all of the games. But attempting to be fair, I will note that this, as is the case for most RPGs of the time, is very grindy. It can lead players to feeling like it's very repetitive, and it's very difficult. The original Final Fantasy games were significantly harder than future titles. Graphics, I rated it at 7.5 out of 10, and while it's definitely dated and obviously very limited by the hardware, the custom creatures and characters and stuff go a long ways for me. The overworld can get a bit boring, just being a flat terrain with mountains, trees set on top obviously, but the combat backgrounds and things really added a lot of depth to the game itself. Controls, I rated it at a 9 out of 10. This game has very simple controls. Outside of directing the character's movements, nearly every input you will do is on a menu and it's simply just up or down. You'll likely have some minor issues with real precise movements, but overall it's very solid and mostly very simple. And for lasting legacy, I rated it at a 10 out of 10. This game shaped the RPG landscape and paved the way for every title since. Nearly 40 years later, the effects of this can still be seen in almost every major RPG. Very few games in history have had as large of an effect on the industry as Final Fantasy III has. Overall, this get 34.5 out of 40 for a total score. Thank you for watching, everybody. I really do appreciate it. Take care, and I hope to see you in the next one.